This is a video which I have made on the topic of set off and carry forward of loss, and this is based on certain questions frequently asked by students to me pertaining to a situation where return of loss is to be filed. Okay, and I believe there is some confusion around, and I thought it's important to make a video and clarify certain things because students might just end up making mistakes and losing marks in the exams if such aspects come in the questions. So the question basically that is which is asked to me is, say this is the current year, okay, and there is a loss which I have incurred in the current year, and I have not filed the return of income or the return of loss in such case because there is a loss. I have not filed such return of loss within the time allowed under section 139(1). That means I have filed the return after the due date. Then can I adjust this loss with the income from another source under the same head? That means can I make intra-head adjustment of this loss in the current year itself? Or can I set off this loss with income under another head? That means can I make inter-head adjustment of this loss in the same year? If the loss cannot be so set off and therefore it remains unabsorbed, can I carry it forward to the subsequent year? Okay. If there is a loss which is unabsorbed of some preceding year or of some earlier year, can I bring it forward to the current year? If yes, then can I set off this brought forward loss within the same head of income or within some other head of income? That means can I do an intra-head or an inter-head set off? And if that loss remains unabsorbed, can I then again carry it forward to the next year? All this can I do if I have not filed the return of loss in time, or is it really necessary to file the return of loss in time? So let me answer these questions. Let me clarify some doubts. First of all, as you know, under step 1, you need to attempt inter-source set off, okay, under section 70. And then you need to attempt inter-head set off under section 71. And still if the loss remains unabsorbed, then you can carry it forward to a subsequent year and then set off against income of that year in accordance with the various provisions covering various categories of losses. And the question is the return of loss necessarily to be filed in such case? Okay, and the answer to this is that certain losses cannot be carried forward. That means if you have incurred a loss in the current year, then you cannot carry forward this loss to the next year, to the subsequent year, unless such loss is determined in presence of a return of loss filed under section 139(3), and such return should be filed within the time allowed under section 139(1). That means if in the current year you have incurred a loss, and if it remains unabsorbed and you want to carry it forward to the subsequent year, then for that you need to file a return of loss within the due date under section 139(1). That means if you are to file a return after the due date, then you really cannot carry forward the loss to the subsequent year. Now what we need to keep in mind is this restriction does not apply to loss under the head income from house property under section 71B, and this also does not apply to unabsorbed depreciation. No. Okay, which means that if you have loss from house property in the current year, or if you have unabsorbed depreciation arising in the current year, and if you have not filed the return of loss within the due date under section 139(1), you can still carry forward such loss to the subsequent year for being set off in that subsequent year. Okay. Barring these two exceptions, this restriction regarding filing of return of loss in time applies to all other categories of losses. For example, capital gain, business income, loss from owning and maintaining racehorses. So it does not apply to income from house property or unabsorbed depreciation, but it applies to all other cases. Now, for all such cases where this restriction applies, the restriction only says that the loss of that year in which the return of loss has not been filed within time cannot be carried forward to the subsequent year. This is the only restriction. You need to have a clarity around the restriction, that this is the only restriction. Now, what this means is only carry forward of loss of year in which it is incurred is disallowed. Therefore, if there is a loss, if there is, say, a business loss, okay, from one business, and there is income from another business in the same year, then you can still set off the loss against that income in the same year, okay, because it's an intra-head set off under section 70. Similarly, if there is a loss under the business head, and if there is income under the other heads except salary, then you know that you can do an inter-head set-off. You can set off the current year's business loss with, say, the current year's house property income in the same year, even if you have not filed a return of loss within time. Okay. What you cannot do is that after intra-head or after inter-head, if there is loss, say, from business which is still unabsorbed, then you cannot carry it forward to the subsequent year if you have not filed the return of loss within time. If you have filed the return of loss properly, then you can carry it forward to the subsequent year. If you had not filed the return of loss within time, then you really cannot carry it forward. So that means inter-source or inter-head set-off of loss in the year in which it arises is allowed. That means it is not affected. Only carry forward is affected. It is disallowed. Similarly, this restriction doesn't apply to the losses of earlier years which are unabsorbed and which you want to bring forward to the current year. You can bring them forward to the current year and set them off, and if they remain unabsorbed, you can carry them forward again to the subsequent year, and the return of loss restriction doesn't apply in such situations. So loss of an earlier year is not affected. It can be brought forward and set off in the current year. So you need to remember that return of loss restriction doesn't apply to loss under the head IHP or unabsorbed depreciation. Similarly, the restriction doesn't apply to inter-source or inter-head set-off in the current year. Okay, only carry forward of such loss to the next year is disallowed. Further, loss of an earlier year is also not affected. You can bring it forward to the current year and set off such loss in the current year. Let's look at an example. In this example, as you can see, there is a loss from house property in Jaipur of assessment year 2018-19, and the return of income for such assessment year was filed after the due date. Okay, so what is the impact? The impact is that since it is loss from house property, the restriction of filing return of loss within the due date doesn't apply. So even if for this assessment year the return was filed after the due date, you can bring forward the loss from house property in the current year, and then you can set it off against income from house property of the current year. So the loss from house property which has been brought forward is 80,000, and then you set off 20,000, and the balance 60,000 you can carry it forward to the subsequent year. Let's look at another example. In this case, there are certain details of income and losses, and it is mentioned that return of loss for the current assessment year was not filed in time. So the current year's return has not been filed in time, and there is, if you can see, there is a loss from house property of the current year of 2,30,000. So the return of loss related restriction doesn't impact this, and therefore you can set off this loss from house property up to the limit of 2 lakh here, and you can then also carry forward the balance loss of 30,000 to the subsequent year, because the income from house property loss, the IHP loss, is not impacted by the return of loss related restriction. There is also a brought forward loss from speculative business of assessment year 2018-19. Okay, so there is this loss of earlier year of 1 lakh rupees, and since the return of loss has not been filed in time for the current year, it was filed in time for this year. That means this particular loss of 1 lakh, you can safely bring it forward to the current year, and then you can set off this loss. And if there is something unabsorbed, then you can also carry it forward to the subsequent year, because the loss pertains to earlier year, it doesn't pertain to the current year. As you can see, again there is a short-term capital loss of the current year of 1,50,000 rupees. Okay, and as we know that the return of current year is not filed in time, so this doesn't mean that you cannot do an intra-head set off. So this short-term capital loss can be set off against long-term capital gain, because long-term capital gain is 1 lakh. So to the extent of 1 lakh, you can set this off, because default regarding return of loss does not impact inter-source set off. But now the problem is that the balance short-term capital loss of 50,000 you cannot carry forward under section 74, as there is default regarding return of loss under section 80. So since the return of loss has not been filed within due time, and there is short-term capital loss of rupees 50,000 which remains unabsorbed, you cannot carry it forward to the subsequent year. This is disallowed because the return of current year was not filed in time. Let's look at the last example. Now here are the details of losses. This is a business loss of 2019-20, business loss of 2018-19, unabsorbed depreciation of 11-12, and we are told that return of loss for 2018-19 and 2020-23, that is the current year, was not filed in time. So that means what happens to business loss of 2019-20? The return of loss for that year was filed in time, and therefore you can bring it forward and then you can set it off in the current year. What about business loss for 2018? We are told that 18-19 return of loss was not filed in time, and therefore this particular loss of 75,000 you cannot carry it forward, and therefore you also cannot set off in the current year. What happens to unabsorbed depreciation of 11-12? This return of loss restriction doesn't impact this in any manner. Okay, and it does not impact, and therefore you can bring it forward and then you can set it off. So hope these aspects are clear to you and you will not make any mistake next time if you encounter any question on this particular point. So just to very quickly recap before we close this video, certain losses cannot be carried forward unless you have filed a return of loss within the time allowed under section 139(1), right? Now, point number 1, this restriction does not apply to IHP loss or unabsorbed depreciation. Number 2, this restriction applies only in case of carry forward of loss of year in which it is incurred. That is disallowed. Point number 3, intersource and interhead in the current year is not affected. Only carry forward is disallowed. Finally, if there is a loss of an earlier year, it is also not impacted. You can bring it forward to the current year and set off in the current year. And if something still remains unabsorbed, then you can take it to the subsequent year if the time period for carry forward has not expired. Hope this is clear to you. Do subscribe to this channel if you want not to miss any video on such useful topics which I keep posting on a regular basis, and do like and share this video with your friends and groups if you find it useful. Thank you and all the best to you.